So welcome, Dr. Howard Fuller.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to thank all of y'all for coming. First of all, I never heard of this conference until this year. And so you see how crazy I am. And, Jimena from Phone to Action is the one who got me all involved. And then when I looked at all of these sessions, I was like, wondered if you and me were going to be talking to each other. So I thank every one of you all for being here. Really appreciate it a lot.
We're delighted that you're here. I didn't mention Dr. Fuller's excellent book, No Struggle, No Progress, which I understand you'll be signing after this session. Yep. I wholeheartedly recommend this book, which tracks Dr. Fuller's journey in life and in the education space. And the title, Howard, is from a Frederick Douglass quote. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. You have been at the forefront of many struggles, and you've made a lot of progress. Talk a little bit about your journey, starting with the Black Power movement and ultimately bringing you to the education movement. And talk about what have been the struggles that you've associated with yourself through the years.
Yeah, I want to start out by, just giving you all a surreal experience that I just had in this room right here, right before our session. There was a session on Mozambique and on Mozambique education. And in 1971, I spent 30 days with the guerrilla column in Mozambique when they were fighting against the Portuguese, the Front for the Liberation of Mozambique. And it was really sort of not weird, but surreal to listen to the representatives from Mozambique talk about what is happening in their country today. And I was able, because 2 chapters of my book deals with Mozambique. And I actually have photographs in there when I was marching with the guerrillas. And it really was a warm moment for me to be able to, give them a copy of my book. And, people don't want to hear about way back in the day, but because it was sort of historical, it was really a cool thing. I guess the best way for me to respond to your question is, I was talking to you about how I was with Kenneth Clark in my office. Kenneth Clark, that's the one who did the doll experiment that was important for the Brown decision. But he was a phenomenal person. And he was in my office looking out the window, and he was sort of saying, Howard, like, I feel like all of the work that I've done over all of these years has meant nothing. And to hear that from somebody like Kenneth Clark was like, what? But now that I'm at this point in my life, I understand what he meant, because you look at the conditions of people today, and you think about all of the things that you've been engaged in. Like when I got involved in organizing in Durham, North Carolina in the war on poverty, I actually thought, man, that a war on poverty meant we're trying to end poverty.
You could win it. You could actually win it.
I went down there thinking, hey, man, people say there's going to be a war, and the objective of the war is to win. So let's end poverty. And I got down there, and one of the dudes that was on the board planning the war was one of the biggest slumlords in the city. And that's when I began to realize that, hey, man, some of these people, it ain't really about winning a war on poverty. It's about making money off of the war on poverty. And so, it's lessons like that. But ultimately, I got involved in education through 2 things. One was the various struggles that took place in North Carolina that were student-led. Like I remember a particular struggle where students walked out around integration issues because they were closing Black schools. And then, I was the person who actually helped create or created or founded Malcolm X Liberation University, which really flowed out of the struggle of Black students during that period on college campuses to get Afro-American studies programs, as they call them then. And particularly it was a struggle on Duke University campus, where the students took over the administration building. And based on taking over that administration building, it led to the creation of the Afro-American Studies program at Duke University. Well, I was engaged with those students. I was actually inside the building. And that discussion led to us deciding to create our own independent schools. And that's what led to the creation of Malcolm X Liberation University. So that really got me engaged in sort of the education space, as y'all call it now. And then when I went back to Milwaukee, I was working for the EOP program, the Educational Opportunity Program at Marquette, and the students at my high school walked out because they had built a brand new high school, and they were going to kick all the neighborhood kids out for purposes of integration. So they came to ask me if I would support their efforts, and it led to the creation of the Coalition to Save North Division. A lot of struggles went down. That ultimately led to the voucher program. And so as quickly as I can talk about it, that's sort of how I got there into this whole education arena.
So let's go back a little farther than that. How did you become an activist?
I think I became an activist. I remember the first time I got arrested. It's funny how you remember stuff like that, but
That's sort of the initiation as an activist, right?
yeah, that was sort of active. We actively got arrested. I was working on my master's degree in Cleveland, Ohio, and we had sat in all night at the school board. And the police came in and told us to leave. I didn't know we was going to get arrested. I had come there from work. I had on one of my only suits. And, I decided to stay there all night. And so when the police came, told us to move, of course, we didn't move. So they threw us down 3 flights of steps, and they had a gauntlet. And as we were coming down the steps, they were beating us. And then they took us and put us in this great big pen, a holding cell. And they began to walk by with their batons, their nightsticks, running across the wire and say, "We shall sing, we shall overcome." And so that was my beginning of, quote, activism. I remember demonstrating in Glenville. That's a part of Cleveland, a community in Cleveland. And ironically, we were laying down in the dirt to keep them from building a school because we said it was going to be all black. That was during my integration period. And we had been laying down in front of the tractors. And on this particular day, what they were doing was they would start up the tractors and they would dump dirt on us. On this particular day, the dude started up the tractor and went backwards, and he crushed a Presbyterian minister named Bruce Clunder. And so that was my first experience actually seeing someone die, fighting for something that we believed in. And that experience, and then on April 3rd, 1964, April 4th, 1964, one of those, I was in Corey Methodist Church, and I heard Malcolm X speak. And that's when he did the famous ballot or the bullet speech. And it changed my entire life, man. I went in there one kind of black person. I walked out of there totally different because he actually debated. Most people don't know this. It was a debate with Louis Lomax. And so if you ever read that speech or listen to it, he'll refer to Brother Lomax. People thought that was the minister of the church. It was actually Louis Lomax, who had written a book at that time on the Nation of Islam. And so Malcolm was debating Louis Lomax. And that was the first time I'd ever seen Malcolm in person and listened to him. And the power of that speech really changed my whole life.
How did it change your life?
Well, I couldn't leave there, man, being a Negro. I walked in there as a nice colored kid who's gonna get his master's degree in social work, and I left there, man, like I gotta do more than that. And I gotta look at myself differently as like a black human being. You could not listen to Malcolm, man, and then just walk away and say, I guess you could. I couldn't. I mean, his words like impacted me to the point that I realized that I could never be the same. And that I had to be a very different black human being than I was when I walked in that church.
How did your color define you at that point in your life?
Well, first of all, I don't know if people read the book, but like I integrated to college by myself.
Which is in your book.
Yeah, so my mother dropped me off. I was 17 years old, man. And she dropped me off at Carroll College. And there wasn't even no black people working there. Seriously, there weren't even no black people in Waukesha, period. And I was coming there on a basketball scholarship. And so I remember, I would never ask anybody to do that because I remember being like in between two worlds and not in either one. Because, I'm out there, black, trying to explain, white people saying, oh, what did you just say? What did that word mean? Why you got a mustache? So I'm trying to figure all of that out, right? and then when I would go home, all my friends would say, man, what's wrong with you? You know what I mean? I didn't know the latest dances. I mean, I was like, so I'm in between two worlds. And so when I got ready to go to graduate school, there was one requirement. I got to be around some black people, man. That either the school got to have some black people or the city got to have some black people. And that's why I went to Cleveland. And I got lucky because these two women, Jean Harris and Una Harris, who I love forever, they looked at me as a little brother. And Jean was going out with John Wooden, who was the tackle for the Cleveland Browns. That was during Jim Brown's days with the Cleveland Browns. So I got in that whole social circle, and how can I put this? I reclaimed myself, or I found myself. I mean, because y'all got to realize, like, man, what it was like to go through that experience at Carroll, which was great in the sense that I made great friends and all that, but it almost destroyed me as a person. And that's why the Malcolm experience, and then with Jean, and I had to get my confidence on how to deal with black women, or women, period. Since, when I was out there by myself, all of these my friends, my fraternity brothers, they would go to Florida and come back, for spring break and all that. And a lot of it was probably lying, but the stories they told, dudes lie. But I wasn't in any of that. So during that whole period, when you're supposed to be doing all that dating and all that stuff, I missed that whole period. And so it took going to Western Reserve and hooking up with Jean and all of that to get that sense of myself.
To become who you are.
Yeah, I think so. Your
book begins here in Austin, Texas.
Yeah.
With a meeting with then governor and candidate George W. Bush.
Yep.
And I'm going to quote you in the book. You said, to my surprise, I ended up liking the dude.
Yeah.
And that led to a relationship. And when he became president, Governor Bush, or President Bush, asked you to come to Washington with him. Talk about the meeting that you had with him here in Austin and how that led to your relationship.
Yeah, it was interesting because I was down here to actually talk to black legislators about trying to support a voucher bill. So they said, hey, you got to go meet with the governor. I was like, oh, man, I don't want to meet with this dude, man. I didn't like his daddy, which was totally unfair. What's it got to do with him? So why I want to meet with him, And it was, no, Howard, you got to meet with him, right? So they set up this meeting. It was supposed to be like a half hour. And it ended up being an hour and a half. And I got in there, and Margaret Spellings, it was Margaret Spellings, a colleague of mine, and
later the Secretary of Education.
Yeah, and George Bush. So I got in there. How when you meet with these governors and stuff, man, usually it's bogus. You sit there and you nod like what they're saying makes sense. You know what I mean? But what he said was, hey, I really don't understand education. I want to learn. And so I actually got a chance to talk. And the meeting went an hour and a half instead of an hour. And when we got up to leave, he said, hey, I'm going to be the next president of the United States. And I was like, yeah, whatever. and he said, would you come to Washington with me? And I was like, hey, man, first of all, I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. I don't believe in none of y'all, none of these parties and stuff. And plus, you need a loyalist. And I'm one of these kind of people, I'm subject to go off, like at any point in time, right? So you need somebody, you don't need nobody like me. And he said, well, but would you help me develop my platform on education? And the interesting thing is, I ended up being on a committee that wrote his first two speeches, the one he gave on education, the one in LA and the one in New York. So I was on the committee to help write the speech. Then when the word came back in Milwaukee that I was working with Bush, oh my God. I mean, people went crazy. Oh man, you done got into bed with the devil. And I was like, hey man, like I'm sitting on the side of the bed, but I didn't get under the sheets. So, it's the way I was trying to explain it. I had to give him an explanation, for what was going on. And then, he invited me to the White House, along with Floyd Flake and Virginia Walton Ford and several other Parental Choice activists. So, you go into the Oval Office, man, and, it's a lot smaller and look on TV, and I'm looking at all of these doors, and I'm wondering, which one of these doors that Clinton, well, I should have, but, I was,
Talk about under the sheets.
Yeah, right, whatever. I didn't say that. You said that. So, no, and then another time, George Bush came to Milwaukee, and they invited me to come out and, be on the receiving line for Air Force One, when they land. And so the president got off, and he was shaking hands, kind of perfunctory, shaking hands. He came to me and he hugged me, right? This was on TV. So all my friends, I saw you hugging up with Bush, man. So, no, but I really like George Bush as a person. I debated this unknown state senator in 1998 from Illinois named Barack Obama, which is in the book too, because they actually recorded it and turned it into a pamphlet, and I quote it in my book. But Barack, who I love and support, he's a different type of personality than George Bush. If you just want to sit down with some dude who you didn't know nothing about him, trust me, you all would like George Bush. Mm-hmm. I mean, literally, he's that kind of person.
He wanted to be the education president.
Yeah.
In fact, he was speaking at the Elmer Booker Elementary School in Sarasota, Florida, when the Twin Towers were struck by terrorists. So ultimately, he didn't become the education president that he wanted. But he did implement, along with Margaret Spelling's No Child Left Behind. What is your view of No Child Left Behind?
Well, first of all, I mean, he also appointed a very good friend of mine to be Secretary of Education before Margaret Spelling's, and that's Rob Page.
Yeah.
And so Bush actually did a lot for education from where I sit. I mean, his support for choice, his support for charters, his support for the kinds of things that I believed in. So I always felt that all of these people announce they want to be the education governor, the education mayor, the education common council member, and president. But I actually think No Child Left Behind, with all of its faults, the one thing that it did do was it forced us to look at what was happening to groups of kids in so-called great schools. Because before then, people would only put out aggregate data. Mm-hmm. And so you could have this great school because of aggregate data, but once you disaggregated the data, what's happening to poor black kids? What's happening to poor Latino kids? What's happening to poor kids generally? So for me, if it did nothing else, No Child Left Behind did that, which was to me extremely important. And there was some poetic something to Bush and Kennedy coming to an agreement on a federal policy.
Right.
And people seem to forget that, because it's hard to remember that there actually was a time not long ago in America where Republicans and Democrats actually could come together for something.
Right.
And that there was a word called compromise. And because of the historical period we're in now, it's hard to realize that. But No Child Left Behind would not have been possible without the kind of bipartisanship that occurred between Bush and Kennedy.
Right. So where does No Child Left Behind fall behind? Where does it fall short?
Well, I mean, I always, felt like even when it said you could provide choice, because it didn't allow for private school choice, that was the problem. I think what really bothers me today is because of the furor around the Common Core, which, interestingly enough, started out as a bipartisan thing, that now all of a sudden we've decided that we shouldn't have tests. And there's a whole bunch of stuff going on right now that I think is going to be detrimental to poor Black and Latino kids, around the issue of standards, around the issue of assessments, and how all of that is done. And so with the reauthorization and with Lamar Alexander's bill, I'm really worried that we're going to move away from the assessment part that I think No Child Left Behind was important. I'm not saying that...
The accountability part.
Yeah, the accountability.
Right. Sure.
And I don't know how you have accountability without testing being an element of it. I don't think that testing ought to be the sole thing that determines it. I think you also need to have a growth aspect to it. You look at value added. But I think to move away from the types of assessment is going to move us backwards. And I believe it's going to be detrimental to poor children in this country.
Yeah. You have been a great proponent of parental choice. Talk about that and how you arrived at that position.
Yeah, what's really interesting about that is, first of all, I support vouchers, I support homeschooling, I support charter schools, I support changes in the traditional system, I support virtual schools. I don't support universal vouchers. I support means-tested vouchers, because I'm not in a fight to give people who got money more money. So, because the way I look at the world, just so you all know, my social psychologist is Chris Rock. So that'll tell you the level that I'm operating at. So, but Sam understands. So, but if you got money, you like right here. If you don't got money, you like right here. I did not get in this to do this. I got in it to do this. Mm-hmm. And so for me, it's about, providing low-income and working-class parents with the capacity to choose. I mean, I take a quote that I got from Bernice King. I just don't think that the Obamas ought to be the only people living in public housing that have choice. And so I give y'all a chance to let that settle a little bit. But you cannot, like a lot of these legislators who are against choice, when you ask them, where do your children go to school? There's so much hypocrisy in this country around providing people with parent choice. And I understand that there's ups and downs, because there's no public policy that only has an upside. So every public policy has an upside and a downside. And what you end up doing at the moment in history in which you live is to try to determine whether or not the upside outweighs the downside. For me, the upside of giving low-income and working-class people options outweighs some of the other issues. But I never came to this issue of choice by reading Capitalism and Freedom. I never even knew that Milton Friedman wrote Capitalism and Freedom when I first came to support vouchers in Milwaukee. It all came out through a series of community struggles that we were engaged in. And so the logic for us was supporting parent choice. And as a black person, anybody who understands the history of black people's struggle for education in America, long before Milton Friedman was ever thought of, when black people came out of slavery, black people came out of slavery with the idea that there's a connection between education and liberation. Mm-hmm. And poor whites bought into the notion that y'all don't need no education because we're going to take care of you. Black people knew that education was a pathway to liberation. And so when we came out of slavery, first of all, we created some schools during slavery. Because when the Freedmen's Bureau got created and they began to do this search all around the South, they found these schools these underground schools that had been set up even during slavery. But so when we came out of slavery, we came out, and really black people were critical to development of the whole public education structure in the South. And so we started these schools, and then when the Compromise of 1877 took place, and they reinstalled the white people in the power that ostensibly the Civil War was fought to get out of power. As you know, one of the things that they did was to take the money out of black schools, give it to white schools, then wouldn't let black people attend those schools. So black people had to develop our own schools and pay taxes for schools that we could not attend. So the idea that parent choice is some foreign phenomenon to black people is historically inaccurate. Mm-hmm. And only people who are ignorant will make statements like that. Now, you can say you oppose it, but you shouldn't act like it's some new phenomena that has just arrived on the American education scene.
So what, in your view, is the very biggest challenge that we have in education today? If there's one thing you can name that's our biggest challenge, our biggest struggle, what is it?
Quality schools for all kids. I mean,
leveling the playing field, in other words.
Just in spite of some of the work that maybe people in this room have done over the past 20 years, the reality of it is that far too many of our children, particularly our poorest children, are not getting the kind of education that would allow them, as Paulo Freire said in his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, to be engaged in the practice of freedom. Because what education really is about is giving people the capacity, the ability to transform their world. And if we do not provide kids, all of our children, with the type of education that they need, not only are their lives at stake, so is the democracy. Because you cannot, as Kenneth Clark said, have a democracy without an educated populace. And we cannot have a society where large numbers of young people, poor people, Black, Latino, poor white kids, are not given the kind of education that they need to try to participate in the transformation of their world.
It's funny because, as I mentioned to you all, I'm the director of the LBJ Presidential Library, and LBJ, 50 years ago this year, signed the Voting Rights Act into law. We saw the celebrations in Selma over the weekend, which is a catalyst for that legislation. LBJ considered it his greatest legislative victory, but he also signed the same year the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And I think he will ultimately be remembered as the civil rights president, but he wanted to be remembered as the education president for the very reasons you suggest. Because education, he realized, as Dr. King did, was the passport to the future. Not civil rights. You don't need civil rights if everyone has an equal access to education. If you could do anything to alter the education system, what would it be? What are the quick wins that you could implement if you had the power to do so?
What's interesting, Mark, is unfortunately, I don't see any quick wins. I really don't. I mean, there's some things that obviously we can do better. We have proved, here's one thing we've proven over the last 20 years, whether it's TFA, KIP, Aspire, High School of Recording Arts in St. Paul. What we have proven, it's a lie that you cannot educate poor kids because they're poor or they come from dysfunctional families. That's a lie. And one of the things that we have proven, if nothing else, that is a lie. And what people have shown is that we can create great schools for kids, but it takes an enormous amount of human capital, not just financial resources. It's the human capital that it takes to create the kinds of schools that our kids need. And what I believe is that we need a 3-sector strategy. That those of us who are out here talking about, I believe we need to eliminate the achievement gap. If you actually believe that, then in my mind, you would want to make sure that low-income and working-class kids have access to private schools, they have access to traditional public schools, and they have access to charter schools. That they have access to all 3 sectors. Because those of you who have more than, if you have 2 kids or 3 kids, those of you who are, who are parents, on any given day, you wake up and you look at one of those kids and you know that there was a mistake that was made at the hospital because one of them could not possibly be yours. I mean, because kids, those kids have very different personalities, have different needs. And we need to provide different types of options for kids. And so if we really believe what we say, that our children are our most precious gift from God, which we don't actually believe in this country, we say it, we would make sure that all of our children have access to great schools across that spectrum. And while there are people talking about that, a lot of the young reformers today, for example, particularly those that have gotten engaged with charters, they see issues like vouchers as political distractions or liabilities. And I'm saying, yeah, it's a distraction if you got money. It ain't no distraction if you're poor. And that if you actually believe in what you say, you should want the poorest children to have access to all of these options and to provide policies that give them, that opportunity. So what worries me today is even amongst the reformers, there are times when we don't understand what it really means to be poor in America. And that's one of the things that I'm most concerned about. And the other thing that I'm concerned about is just the role that race plays in all of this. And I'm very worried about places like New Orleans and Memphis and Newark and Camden and all of these places that we've picked as places where we're going to plant the flag of reform. The problem is you keep hearing from those communities that this ed reform is being done to us and not with us. And if we don't figure out how to address that fundamental problem, the long-term sustainability of this ed reform stuff is in danger. Because the difference between this movement and many other social movements is this movement is not being led by the people who are most impacted by the movement. And we've got to understand what that means and what we've got to do differently to sort of deal with that reality.
So I'm going to go back to the issue of race in a moment, but you talked about the importance of human capital. That means getting good teachers in schools to lift them up. Right. How do you recruit better teachers?
I wish I knew the answer to that. I mean, the first thing I try to tell people, and all my TFA friends know I've said this before, but one of the interesting things that young people run around today is everybody run around calling everybody awesome. And my view is, hell, all of y'all ain't awesome. You know what I mean? Some of y'all are just like, just like regular people. And that in reality, if it's going to take awesome people for us to win, we're not going to win. Because what we really got to do is find a way for just regular people to get awesome results. And that means that we've got to develop systems and methodologies that allow for these regular people to do phenomenal things in the classroom. Like, for example, I chair the board of a charter school, 9 through 12 in Milwaukee. And in February every year, I teach. And so as some people in this room know, Paul wrote this book about teach like a champion. And so he's got like 49 different things that you're supposed to do to teach like a champion. I went in there a few weeks ago. I did like 3, man, and I was exhausted, by the end of the day. Because to do this work, first of all, this work of being a teacher is hard.
It's hard work.
This is hard work. And to do it every single day and to be on every single minute of every single day is just hard. And so what we've got to try to figure out is not only how to recruit people who can become great teachers, but we've also got to figure out a way not to kill those teachers in the process.
How to recruit them and retain them.
Right, but a part of the retaining is we've got to be more cognizant of the difficulty of the work and the impact that it has on teachers' lives. You know what I mean? And I don't know how we're going to do that because the work is so hard. But it's going to require some different approaches. It's going to, the reason why I think conferences like this is huge, it's going to require different ways of using the technology. I do think that personalized learning is one thing that is going to help us. It's not this is going to solve all of our problems, but it's one of the important elements I think we got to figure out how to do more of and how to do it better as we go in the future. In order to get to this issue of how to get kids with people who can really give them a great education, but that it can be done in a way that doesn't wipe them out totally.
Right.
In the process.
Being a teacher, Howard, might be hard. Being a superintendent is really hard, and you write very vividly about that in your book. And it burned you out at the end. But talk about that experience. And it was very illuminating, and ultimately it seems very rewarding, but it really did take its toll. Yeah,
I want to make it clear, though, being a superintendent is not as hard as being a teacher. Or they're different hards. Maybe that's the way to put it. And people used to talk to me about the pressure you're under. Man, I'm like, hey, man, pressure is being a mother with 6 kids trying to figure out how to feed and clothe them and get them to school. That's pressure. So the pressure that you're under as a superintendent, it is intense, but it's a very different kind of pressure. And it's particularly intense if you actually care. If you go in there and you're a careerist, and essentially you're going to be making decisions based on how to advance your career, you can do that, and it's not going to do what it did to me. Because I went in there actually trying to make a change. I went in there and it really, it got to my soul. A part of that job just got to my soul. And it had less to do with kids and everything to do with adults. Because as a superintendent, what you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, man, are adult issues. And what you're trying to figure out is how to move aside those adult issues to help kids. So one of the things I did that helped me is, there were 154 schools in Milwaukee, and I visited all 154 schools. It took me 4 years, which is as long as I lasted, to go to every single school. And what I did also was, my first day as a superintendent, instead of going to the central office, I went to an 8th grade classroom. And my theory was, I'm going to adopt this 8th grade class. And if I make it 4 years, I want to see what happens to these kids. And there were 29 of them. And by the time I left 4 years later, only 13 of that 29 graduated. And for each of the 13, there was a story. And for each of the 16 that didn't graduate, there was a story. And when I realized the world had passed me by was when I went to the home, because I did home visits. You know, like when they asked me as superintendent, what kind of car do you want? I told them I wanted a van. And I used to use the van to go around and pick kids up and take them to basketball games and all this kind of stuff, right? And I visited these 29 kids. I did home visits. I kept up with them. You know, Dan actually knows this. And so I went over to one girl's house the week or 2 weeks before I was my last days. This girl was 17 years old, man. She was still in the 9th grade. She had 3 babies by 3 different dudes. And I was talking to her and her mother, and I was the only one who thought there was a problem. That's when I knew the world had passed me by, man, because I'm sitting there like, y'all don't think this is a problem? You're in the 9th grade, you're 17 years old, and you got 3 babies by 3 different dudes, and I'm the only one who sees an issue? So it was that kind of stuff, man, that like just got to my soul. You know what I mean? I had proposed, for example, shifting $50 million out of high schools to elementary schools. And you have to understand how school districts work. The most well-organized people in school districts are high school people. And so they you know, it's mostly, and that's where a lot of white men are, by the way, in a lot of districts, right? And there's a whole history to that if you want to get into it. But anyway, so we had these hearings, right? And these people organized this stuff. I remember one young lady put her finger in my face and said, Dr. Fuller, you're tearing away my dreams. And she was in a program that hadn't graduated anybody in years. And I knew that. And it just ripped your heart out. I'm going to give you another example of the kind of things that just, I tried to get a referendum passed to build new school buildings. And this is a very interesting story. And so we had all these hearings. Every time you do something in a school district, you got to hold hearings. So I'm out there, and one white lady put her finger in my face and said, we're not going to build schools on the north side for lazy black women on welfare. But there was another one where because a part of my proposal was to create more space for early childhood. And so there was a young black woman who, at Hamilton High School, stood up with her baby. And it was an auditorium packed with white people opposed to the referendum, right? And she said, you know, I support Dr. Fuller's referendum because I would like to have more early childhood for my baby. These people hollered at her, you shouldn't have had the damn baby in the first place. Now, here's the interesting part of that story. Last year, or 2 years ago, I can't remember now, I was giving a speech at Morehouse. This young woman came up to me and said, Dr. Fuller, do you remember me? And I was looking at her, well, I don't remember. She said, do you remember at Hamilton High School? And together we said, you shouldn't have had the damn baby in the first place. And she said, I want you to meet somebody. We walk outside. Her son was a freshman at Morehouse.
Wow.
It was,
wow.
So there was some stuff like that that makes these battles worthwhile. But when you're going through it, it rips away your soul.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just...
So intertwined in the whole issue of education is race. Let me go back to the issue of race for a moment. Have we progressed on the issue of race as much as you would have hoped upon hearing Malcolm X in 1964?
You know what? I try to talk about it in the book. Anyone who says no change has happened in America, that's a ridiculous assertion, right? But what's also true is a lot has changed and a lot hasn't changed. And let me give you just like a couple examples. I started a group called the Fuller, they call themselves the Fuller Torch Fellows. There's 10 of them now, but it started out 6 of them. Young black professionals. You know, because young people always say to old people like me, y'all don't ever tell us nothing. Y'all trying to hold on forever. You ain't trying to get off the stage. So I started this group, you know, with like an intentional strategy to try to pass on. But I also believe that it's a two-way learning thing. Just because you're young, it don't mean you don't know nothing. You know, this whole idea you're supposed to sit at old people's feet, first of all, it's not a good idea for a whole variety of reasons. But one of the young men in this group, his name is Curtis Sales, and he works for TFA, actually. But what he's doing right now, he's in the leadership of a group that's called Justice for Dontre Hamilton. Dontre Hamilton was a young black man who was shot 14 times in Milwaukee. The irony of this is that in 1981, I led a group called the Coalition for Justice for Ernest Lacy, along with Michael McGee. This was a young black man who was killed in police custody in almost the same way that the dude was killed in New York. 1981, 2015. And so what happens is, although you know that change has happened, when these kind of things occur, it's harder to appreciate the change. Mm-hmm. And so what you keep asking yourself is, I haven't done enough. Or what I tell myself, I haven't done enough. How can this continue to happen? You know, it's just like the Selma thing. I mean, I was tweeting, for those who follow me on Twitter. By the way, if you don't follow me on Twitter, Howard L. Fuller is my handle. I just shamelessly asked you to follow me. But always trying to build up followers. But anyway, I've been mad the whole weekend, right? So I started tweeting about, first of all, can somebody give Giuliani a copy of Langston Hughes' poem, I Too Am America? I mean, because the stuff that came out of this fool's mouth about loving America, this was like insane, man. Like, what are you talking about? I mean, those people who were on that bridge 50 years ago, they loved America. But what they were trying to do was to fight for the realization of the promise of America. It's not possible for me to hear Giuliani say that Obama don't love America and hear these same people talk about we got to take America back. Back from who? And so, and you're talking about voter ID? We're marching, Selma was about voting rights, right? Explain to me what problem voter ID is solving. What to me, voter ID is a latter-day literacy test. So here we are 50 years later with people proposing ideas that will hinder people's capacity to vote. You march across a bridge, John Lewis got beaten nearly to death. For what? Fighting for the right to vote. So, you know, like I've only read the first 3 chapters of Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. But the most powerful part of the book is sort of the historical analysis that she's making about how Jim Crow returns in a different form. And so even though you can see change, you can also see the reemergence of that which we fought against in a different form. And that's the most frustrating. And a lot of young people today say, well, we live in post-racial America. I don't know what the hell that is. I mean, I think I know, I kind of know, but some people feel that once Barack got elected, it was all over. What are y'all talking about? He's in the White House. And I'm saying, yeah, but poor people, a disproportionate number of them who are black and brown, are suffering in America because of policies in America. If you read The World is Flat, that's a scary book, man. Unless you read their other book that used to be Us, which is scarier than The World is Flat. No, really, in terms of what it is that's happening to people without resources in this country. And race is a major part of it, but we also got to understand it's both a race and a class issue. And that some of the times we come up with racial solutions for problems that are fundamentally a class problem. And so I'm always struggling with that issue.
So what is at the root, then, of the racial divide?
Is that white supremacy. I mean,
Is that what it boils down to?
yeah, I mean, we can pontificate, but at the end of the day, there's still a strand in our country that essentially sees white skin privilege as okay, and that there is no such thing, and that we somehow think that we've eradicated all of the racial realities that used to be there because we, for the most part, ended legal apartheid in America. But the dimensions of race, see the thing about racial oppression is the action of racism. Racism is an idea, it's an abstraction, right? And in a dialectical sense, what happens is abstractions take on new forms. And then when they work in practice, they reappear in a different form, which is what we just talked about. And so what I'm trying to get people to understand is that the ideas about race still exist in this country in different ways. But that's not the same as to say no change has been made.
But I'm hearing too, there's certainly a racial divide,
Yep.
division between black and white, and that's endemic to our culture in large measure. But there's also, what you're suggesting, is an increasing gap between rich and poor. And that's part of the problem too.
Yes.
Talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, William Jewis Wilson wrote this book called The Declining Significance of Race. And what he really talked about in that book was that in the future, at the point that he wrote it, that a black person's life chances were going to be more greatly influenced by their class than their race. And I would argue that to a large degree that is true. Because your chances in life today, if you're black and you got money, that's not to say that if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, just because you're black, something's going to happen to you. But if you got a lot of money, chances are you ain't going to be in the wrong place at the right, you know. And the realization of the class issue. Like, for example, if you read this book, The Color of School Reform, by Jeffrey Hennick and his colleagues, which is really a very important book, it raises, what they did was, they did an analysis of 5 school districts at the time that they did it that was controlled by black people. And it was Atlanta, Detroit, Baltimore, D.C., and one other. In fact, they did Detroit when my wife was the superintendent. And they asked the question, black people are in control of these school districts, how come black kids are seemingly no better off? And it's because there's a class character to this. And that the reality of it is school districts are as much of an economic enterprise as they are an educational enterprise. And that when you start talking about radically transforming these districts, you get a lot of pushback from black people because of the economic impact of those changes. In addition to whatever philosophical issues they have around public, and we keep making the mistake of equating public education and the system that delivers it as if they're the same thing. And I would argue that they're not. The Milwaukee Public School System is not public education, it's a delivery system. And since it wasn't created by God, we could change it. That public education is the idea. We created delivery systems to realize on the idea. But the point I'm trying to make is, though, that system, it provides jobs. It provides contracts. So you got to understand that when people start resisting the change, the resistance has very little to do with kids. It has everything to do with the economics of what it is that we're talking about. And so for a lot of black people then, their entree to the middle class was school districts, principals and teachers and central office people. And so when you start talking about radically changing that, you're talking about impacting their economic interests. And so that's what's so difficult to see, because people see the race part of it. I mean, like, look at New Orleans, right? And I've spent a lot of time down there, as some people in this room might know, and I've talked to all kinds of black people deeply. No matter how you cut it, no matter how you explain it, all of those black teachers not getting their jobs after Katrina, it wiped out a whole segment of the middle class in New Orleans. And we can come up with reasons, and some good reasons, but you can't not understand that. Or you can't not understand the economic impact of school closings. Who does that impact? And then you look at the optics. You close a school in the black community, most of the people who lose their jobs are black, and then we introduce a new CMO that's run by white people. And then people say, why y'all mad? I mean, hello? You know, I'm just saying that these issues are issues that are really impacting the long-term sustainability of ed reform in America. And have a race dimension and a class dimension.
Let me open it up to questions, and while we wait for the queue to develop, talk about this notion of race fatigue, which is very much an idea that you reject.
Yeah, I do. I spoke in a black church yesterday in Winston-Salem. And some of you all know Shelby Steele wrote this book called Content of Our Character. And in it, he makes the case that those black people, like some of us in this room who got degrees and stuff, we don't have no responsibility to these low-life black people who have not taken advantage of all that America has to offer. I operate with a different perspective. I operate under the notion that to those of us who much is given, much is required. And that I have a responsibility as someone who's got a degree and stuff to help those brothers and sisters who don't have the opportunities that I have. That I got a special responsibility to do that.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate what you're sharing with us. And I spent 2 years serving in AmeriCorps Vista, so we were asked to take the approach of how do communities own and build solutions to fight poverty, and education is at the core of that. I worked in rural areas where I really got to see what you're talking about, where there are class issues as much as there are racial divides, and there would be parents that had children that were working 3 part-time jobs. Their kids would come to school in kindergarten or first grade lacking really important things that child needed. And I agree with you that every child can learn, but when they start so far behind, it's very difficult for them to catch up. So my question is, what can we do to, one, I guess I'm asking, what do you think we need to do about universal pre-K or that kind of support before they get to kindergarten, first grade? And what are some of the barriers that are standing in our way to get that done?
Okay, I'll try to be quick. First of all, I support universal pre-K. Let me just say that. But I think America is very good at making us make false choices. And the choice that now is before us is, we got to start putting all our money with the young people, get a greater bang for the buck. We're going to do pre-K. What about all of these kids that are already in the system that we have failed to educate? And by the way, who the hell are going to be the parents of the pre-K kids? And so my view is that in a country like America, we should not be making that choice. That we should be taking care of pre-K, after pre-K, middle school, high school, college. We have the capacity in America to do that. The reason why we're not going to do that is because we've decided that we're never, ever again going to have a tax in America that gets raised. And so we're going to fight wars, we're going to do everything, but we ain't going to raise no money to do none of that. And in fact, we're going to cut back on what it is we're currently doing and ask all of y'all to do more. And so if you read that Used to Be Us by Friedman and Mandelbaum, the key thing that they talk about are the 5 pillars that made America great, and talks about the need to be able to have compromise to create grand bargains to deal with huge problems. Our greatest barrier today is we have no space in America to create a grand bargain because people get up today and they think about themselves as Democrats or Republicans before they think about themselves as Americans. And when you have a president who gets elected and the head of the Senate says, my first job is to make sure that you are one-term president, meaning no matter what you bring forward, we're saying no. Explain to me how we're going to tackle huge problems like what you just raised. We're not. And that's the tragedy of America today.
Hi, Dr. Fuller. My name is Warren, and I went to Morehouse actually, and I've seen you. It seems like I'm traveling and following you around the country over the last 4 years I've been in education. It's been a great privilege, and I wanted to actually know. I taught in Atlanta public schools for a little while, and one of the things that you said that most resonated with me was the idea that the people who are in the forefront in leading this movement are not necessarily the people who are the most disenfranchised. And I wanted to know from your perspective. I taught a high school full of young black males, and it was really hard for me to like motivate and inspire some of them. So I just wanted to know, with the work that you've been doing and being in this for years, what are some tactics or some things that you've employed to like help people who are the most disenfranchised members of this community step up and become leaders?
Yeah, I really don't have any magic, man. All I know is you just got to be relentless. And you got to be real with these kids, man. Because I tell these kids all the time at our school, hey, man, like an education in America guarantees you nothing. But I guarantee you ain't going to have nothing without an education. And the reality of it is, just like some of y'all were knuckleheads, when you were younger, you got knuckleheads, but some of them can be reached. The issue is we got to find different ways to reach kids. And the thing is, what I would encourage you is even when you think that you're not getting through, you may be getting through because they're too cool to tell you that you're getting through. And so the one thing I'm convinced of is they will never be different if no one ever tells them anything any different. And so what we got to do is just keep going in there every day. We got to try to figure out how to use smartphones, how to use whatever we can use to try to reach them. And you got to go at it with the idea that I'm going to reach every single one of them, but the reality probably is you're not going to reach every single one of them. But if you don't go in there, we don't go in there every day and keep going at it, it's not going to happen. And the last thing I would say is we need to look around the country and figure out who is using certain things that seem to work. Because we are learning a lot. I'm not sure how well we're sharing what it is we're learning across a wider spectrum of people.
We have time for one more question.
Thanks so much. My name is Jeremy. I'm from New York City, and I want to start off by saying that I'm totally with you, and my whole life will be about fighting for minority and poor communities and students. I wanted to ask a question about your stances and sort of what may be unintended or intended consequences. So a couple of those things are the voucher system's consequence on the future of public teaching as a profession, the separation of church and state, and then on the rising economic inequality that we're seeing that may be in part due to rising privatization in the last 20 or so years.
Yeah. On the last one, man, I don't think economic inequality has anything to do with rising privatization. I mean, that's just me. The reality of deindustrialization that has taken place in this country and the impact of the rising economic inequality, I don't see how that's at all connected to things like vouchers or anything like that. I think it's much more connected to economic policy. I mean, because if you were to ask me what would have the greatest impact on life chances of kids, education policy or economic policy, I would say economic policy. And they influence each other. So I don't know if I'm getting the question, but I don't see some of the things that I'm fighting for as being a basis for helping economic inequality in this country. Because my view is if I give kids access to all three sectors, to the extent that education will help with the rising income inequality, that will happen. But I'm not at all, I mean, I don't think our education policy is the thing that's going to turn economic policy in this country. That when we get kids a great education, what we're doing is we're giving those individual kids a better shot at life. We're not changing the fundamentals of economic inequality in this country. And we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that. But what we are doing is creating a greater possibility for some of those kids to have a better life. And then you hope they will have an impact on the larger macro economic policy. But I'm not too optimistic about that. But what was the first part, though?
There were two others, like church and state. So if, if there's more money toward private, then it's...
Yeah. Here's the thing, man. I work for Marquette University. I got people sitting at Marquette University hollering at me about vouchers who's sitting there with a Pell Grant. Hello? Last time I looked, Pell Grant was government money, and your behind is at a Jesuit university with public money. Now tell me how you do that. And then you're gonna holler at me about giving a kid a voucher? You know what I'm saying? I mean, I'm not saying you, I'm just saying, this ain't got nothing to do with you, man. No, seriously. I'm just talking about the hypocrisy of some of our arguments, and that we see no contradiction, in that is the point that I'm trying to make. Because we decided a long time ago that it was good policy to give kids a Pell Grant, young people, so they can access whatever school works in this country, public or private. Why wouldn't we want to do that at the elementary and secondary level? What's the rationale for not doing that at the elementary and secondary level? And one last thing, what was the first part you raised? I know I'm going.
First part was you probably get a lot of pushback from unions, collective bargaining rights, and my father was a teacher for 40 years. I was a public school teacher. Right. They probably disagree with a lot of the voucher system. So
but again, a part of that goes to allowing ourselves to say that the public education system is public education. I'm arguing public education is an idea. We can develop all kinds of delivery systems to realize on the idea. Once you give up on that fundamental point, which I never will, so I see myself as a strong supporter of public education. I just want a different delivery system. Because the thing that I'm clear about is if we don't educate these kids, there is another public institution waiting for them called prisons. So I'm just saying.
We're out of time. Howard, you said that not everybody's awesome, but I think the audience would agree that Dr. Howard Fuller is awesome.
Thank you very much.
And thanks so much.